Hello and welcome to Coming Home, Survive and Thrive in Homeschooling. Today I'm talking with Nathan, our eldest, to whom books are especially important. It could be that there is a philosophy of books, but I'm not sure. It's all very well to say books are important, but to say chocolate is nice without knowing what it tastes like is like saying books are great and not saying which ones. So, what is a great book? And more importantly, as a homeschool mum, give me the list and teach me how to find more. I think that's what most homeschooling parents would say. Welcome, Nathan. Thank you so much for digging around in your book log and imparting us with your opinion on what a great book is and the list that's going to come.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad I kept the book log all those years. Looking back over it was quite refreshing. I've done a lot, actually. I've travelled very far.
Oh, it's fun looking back at books that you've read.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm just thinking that the list of books that you have got, before we dig into those, let's go and just run over like a philosophy of books, because everybody has like a little mini book list, if you like, but it's quite another thing to be that keen like you were to say, interview me, Mum, about books. So books are really important to you, I know that, but can you tell us why books are important to you and just what the philosophy of that is for you?
Well, the biggest thing is they save you a lot of time, because you only have one life to live. So most books incorporate dozens of other people's lives, and you can learn quite a lot from them. So it's about efficiency. If I was being an economist about it, I'd say it does save a lot of time, because you can't make all the mistakes on your own. Life's too short for that. So you might as well let other people make mistakes. Since they've written down their conclusions, you can learn from those nice and easy. Sometimes it's also a bit of an escape, although I only read maybe 3 or 4 fiction books a year. Mostly it's non-fiction, because I want to try and learn how the world works, and I've got a specific project that I'm working on that sort of holistically connects all the books that I read. But apart from that, books are important because there was old philosophy that I remember when I was doing martial arts was, you better practice today, because when the time comes that you are in front of an opponent and he practiced today, he will beat you if you don't. So that's kind of how I think about books as well, is that when I come to a conversation with somebody, or come to write something, or need to analyze something, and I haven't done the requisite work, I will fail at that, or I will have someone trick me, or I will miss an opportunity because I couldn't see it properly. And so it's kind of a bit of a rational fear, I suppose, that keeps me going. Just as any good fighter or athlete would. If you don't train or go to the gym today, you won't perform on Saturday. It's the same thing with writing. So, my job is reading and writing, and if I haven't done the requisite work, I won't write good enough copy, and people won't like it. They won't learn something from it, and I will miss opportunities, and I don't like that. So I'd rather solve those problems today.
So it's like being intellectually fit, really, isn't it? We hear about exercising mind muscles, and I guess that would fit into that. Something I should have said at the beginning, I'm going to pop it in right now for listeners, is don't worry about making a list as we go of what books Nathan is talking about. Just relax and enjoy it, concentrate on what he's saying, and we will have his list of books in the show notes for you. All right then, so what would you define a good book to be, Nathan, given that, what would be categories? Good books, not so good books, rubbish books. How would you grade them?
Usually when you're approaching a topic for the first time, anything that you can get is going to be revelatory, because you haven't seen it before. Over time, though, you do have diminishing returns, and you start to separate the wheat from the chaff, and you go, well, that was a good book, but I wish I didn't waste time doing that. I wish I knew earlier. It's hard to sort of do that. You can take people's recommendations, academics or historians, and go in their bibliography and say, well, I wrote this book, and here are the books that I used in order to get this book, so you could start with that list. But even then, there's probably books that an academic would read that they would go later on, oh, I wish I didn't waste my time doing that. So it's kind of a how long is a piece of a string question, like what is a good book? I tend to sort of look at things maybe in a more chronological form. I have a personal bias that says that most books written after about 1917, especially non-fiction, are usually not worth your time, unless you can find a specifically good one. written by people at the time talking about things that they actually experienced in the 20th century. They're usually not worth your time if you're talking about history. Most history written after that is relatively corrupted, and this is not the podcast to go into why, but that's my rule of thumb, is that any history or discussion on how the world works after 1917 is usually not worth your time. But there's a lot of books, thankfully, prior to that are just fantastic. I mean, they're written by people who are 2 or 3 standard deviations smarter than most people, and that's just normal back then. They were wicked smart people. So I would go with putting a pin in 1917 and saying anything prior to that is good. What else makes a good book is, especially for the topic that we're on, which is books for boys, high agency is key. You don't really want to take a protagonist like Harry Potter, for instance, and use him to teach your boys how to act, because Harry Potter reacts to everything. He doesn't have very much agency at all. Other characters do in that book, like the villain, for instance, even Hermione sometimes. But Harry Potter doesn't. His whole attitude is, how do I respond to this problem? And there's a fine line there in talking about hero stories, because most hero stories are in a form responsive. They are responding to some call to adventure somewhere. But in the book, agency must come out. The ability to change your fate, or to direct your fate, or to control decisions, to make bad and good decisions. That there is no Deus Ex Machina, for instance, where something just reaches into the story and moves things around so that the hero doesn't get in trouble. Good books usually account for all of those problems and sort of route around them, or write in ways that don't stumble on them. And I think that's key. So that's for fiction as well. Other than that, whatever makes you go on to the next book, I think, in extreme motivation, and you're encouraged to go and find the next part of the story, that would dictate that you're reading a good book. But ultimately, a lot of it's just subjective. Your style might be different from my style, and how long is a piece of string? Well, it depends sort of what you're looking for in the book, I suppose.
I'm pleased you put Harry Potter in there, because I don't regard Harry Potter as literature in the same way that I would put Tom Sawyer, or even, I know it's books for boys, so we'll stick with Tom Sawyer, or Tom Brown's School Days, for instance. I wouldn't have put that in the same category. I think the Harry Potter books are important to be reading, because they're products of the time in which our children were growing up, and so much a part of our culture. But it doesn't take long to get into the body of that book and compare it to how the dialogue for Tom Sawyer has been written. One is literature and one is a good book, but they're not to be confused. So given that then, and that this is about books for boys, we're going to concentrate on what to give our young men today. No doubt there will be a bit of crossover where girls will be interested, but I really want to focus on books for boys. So first of all, can we focus on your list that you've got there of the young boys from about 8 to 12, I think you said. For some boys, 12 will be a little bit flexible, because it's moving generally from an age of concrete thinking into more abstract thinking. So there could be a little bit of flexi in there, but let's have a good look at your list for this age group. So what have you just started, and maybe you can explain where you think it's appropriate, for why you think that book is good for a boy, or why it's even on your list. Off you go.
Yeah, I did pick 8 to 12 arbitrarily, because I think before that, the boy or the child, at least, it doesn't matter what sex, they are probably learning how to read more than they are learning what they want to read. After that, 12 to 13, as you say, it's sort of amorphous. It is grey there, but there is a definite change of hormones, I suppose, in a boy. The things that they will want to read will change. When you before you reach adolescence, your mind is sort of a little bit more open. You'll a bit more be able to see the world. After that, however, things start to close in on sort of 1 or 2 topics, and that's about it until you reach sort of early 30s. So let's start with the 8 to 12s. I mean, I haven't put this in any specific order. These are the books that I've read. That has been my categorization here. They cover all of the bases that I just mentioned before: high agency, good history, engaging, that sort of thing. And this is sort of what I came up with. I think the first one which came to mind when I was writing this, so I did put it at the top, was the book called The Tracker by Tom Brown Jr., who's an American author. He's an environmentalist, he would call himself that. But he has a very interesting history which got me intrigued. I think I read this book maybe a dozen times growing up because it was just so fascinating. And I think I've collected a lot of his other books as well. But as a young man, very young man, he sort of bumps into a Native American, Indian, whatever you want to call them, over in America. He lived, I think it was in Minnesota or in somewhere in the Midwest. And the Native American taught him how to track animals, essentially. And this is the sort of guy, the older Native American, could run across leaves without making a sound, like in the middle of autumn. He was just that good being in the outdoors, always wore bare feet, and that was just his way. He taught Tom Brown how to appreciate the universe of all of the animals and the flora and fauna and that sort of thing. Tom Brown would go out for days on end into the pine woods, he called them, the pine barrens, I think, and just track animals, not necessarily to capture them or eat them. He used to go shooting, he said, but with a camera. And that was later on. And he teaches people how to track, and how he has his own tracking school. He's written a dozen books on survival, and he's even written the book called The Science and Art of Tracking, which was fascinating. I remember creating a sand trap back at our old family home where I used to practice my own tracking in there, just to see what he called pressure releases on the edge of your foot showed the tracker what that person was doing at the time. And I used to love this stuff because I was going out in the bush on my own. But in New Zealand, we don't really have any mammals that are around aside from the introduced ones, cats, dogs, rabbits, that sort of thing. But to hear about the fact that you could differentiate between a crack in a stick that came from a two-legged standing upright beast as opposed to a four-legged one, just by hearing the crack in the stick, just that fascinated me. So I wanted to learn sort of more of that. And I guess it's the imagination that I got out of that was incredible. So I definitely recommend Tom Brown Jr., all his books, but you start with The Tracker. It's very easy for a young boy to read, and they'll just want to get outside. So I really enjoyed that one.
I remember that book being significant for you. I don't remember where you came across it. Do you remember?
You bought it back from a bookstore called Wheeler's. Just you grabbed a bunch and you came back one day with them. And I think we'll get to the series that you also came back with later on. But I think that might have been the same trip. It was like one of those times where you just came back with gold for some reason. And you didn't ask about it. You just bought it and you brought it back. So I picked it up and read it, and I couldn't put it down. And like I say, I must have read it about a dozen times.
They specialised in good educational books, so I knew that mostly what was available there was going to be a good pick.
Yeah.
Anyway, carry on. What's next?
The next one I've got, because I've read it now a few times over my years, is King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard. He also wrote a handful of other ones. Of course, the one I've got directly underneath that is Allan Quartermain, which is a similar story, but different in a way. He has also written a few others that it's sort of lower down the list and I haven't included. But King Solomon's Mines especially, it's a fake story, obviously. It's fiction, but it's sort of set in Africa where a British adventurer, discovers a rumor of obviously King Solomon's Mines, and he wants to go and see if he can find it. Grabs a posse of people, great large-in-life characters as well, and they go into the heartland of Africa through all these trials and tribulations and obstacles, have these giant battles which are just completely ridiculous, that there's no way could happen. But there's an attitude to it of adventure. Like at the time that they were writing this book, this is in the mid 1800s, I suppose. I haven't actually checked the exact time that it was published, but in that time there was still that old feeling of we have so much to see in this world that no one has ever been, places that no European especially had ever stepped. And part of that attitude of pushing out into the unknown is really captured in this book, and I've really enjoyed it. And of course they have this, they do come across, I'm not giving anything away, they do come across King Solomon's Mines, but what does that actually mean? What happens after that? All the dynamics in between the crew that actually found it and then the natives who are nearby, it's all very captured quite well, and it's so easily written. Now for back then, you might think, well, for an 1800s book, can it be possibly easy to read because you might have experience yourself? It is easier. It's an easy read. It's good for 8 to 12 books, and of course that adventure is really high in there. So King Solomon's Mines and Allan Quartermain. I would shift from there and say Call of the Wild by Jack London that really stands out in my head too, because different from White Fang, which is another one, but I don't remember that one nearly as well. Not necessarily because it was inferior. It just doesn't have a story that captured me nearly as much as Call of the Wild. Call of the Wild is, of course, from the perspective of, I think it was Buck, the domesticated dog, who somehow finds himself as part of a sled up in the Yukon, I think, the really North America, and he's amongst a whole bunch of other dogs, and of course the dynamics is pack dynamics, and how does this guy, this domesticated dog, fit into almost feral dogs, and being part of that pack? Where does he sit himself? Of course, you've got the human dynamic of the actual sled rider as well. They're in the middle of the wild. He's never done this before. And, it's a very anthropomorphized dog. Like, it's not really talking about a dog. It's really talking about people. It's just with the dog as sort of the proxy. And it's a great story that just keeps you rolling through. You don't know quite where it's going to go, and the things that Buck has to deal with as a dog. You can sort of feel yourself going through those as well, because I think it is a metaphor of adolescence, as you sort of go, you were domesticated, now you have to deal with the real world of, so to speak, men and your own masculinity, and how do you deal with the sled being society or a metaphor of the state. How do you fit into that?
That's interesting. Have you read something that it could be that a metaphor?
That's what I picked up on it. I could be completely wrong, but I mean, looking back over it as an adult, that seems to be. There's a handful of books that do that, using analogies as for animals. But I think this one particularly captures it quite well. Jack London, being a great writer as well. Following from that, I think 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. If I could choose any Jules Verne book, it would be that one. The Nautilus was fascinating to me. I've always enjoyed the idea of just looking over the sea and looking at the animals underneath it. They are, they're just so alien to us. And of course, the captain is just this larger than life figure, and he actually connects quite well with Allan Quartermain in that sense from the H. Rider Haggard books, because they were sort of, I think, contemporaries of each other. Jules Verne and H. Rider Haggard, and there's a lot of that milieu of just adventure and just thinking differently about what sort of characters to create. They weren't sort of copying off old Greek and Roman myths or anything. They were just making their own new character. And this was at the birth of the scientific revolution as well, and the industrial revolution. So they had these huge industrial sized submarines, which are completely, even now we can't even create them with our great technology. Back then though, they had these imaginations, and it was just going around the world, and obviously there's drama in it as well. But again, pushing into a place that most people don't think about, which is the great depths, talking about science and what could happen with all of this, and just that imagination was sort of, I remember, capturing me quite well. So 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I would choose Journey to the Center of the Earth as well, but I found that one, maybe for the 8 to 12-year-old bracket would be better, but I don't think I'd read that again as an adult. It's just it's too fanciful, I suppose. Just a little too much on the fantasy side. But next set I've got is The Great Escape Stories by Eric Williams. Now, the only reason I picked this up is because it was in my book log, and I remember reading this. And of course, most of them are World War II, World War I, maybe even before that, in the Napoleon era. But they are, the pit of man against man in a closed environment where the victory is escape or death, basically. And of course, during World War II, you had, the escape from Colditz Castle, for instance. That was actually a big piece. That's why I remembered this book. There was such a lot of ingenuity going on there. People really trying to figure out how to get over the guards in a time when World War II had really no electronics. So there was no surveillance, no sort of register of tremors under the ground so they could stop you digging, or there was no surveillance cameras, or there was no electromagnetic sort of surveillance at all. It was all basically high industrial level technology, but it was you versus the other guy. If they didn't see you, then there was no way of being seen. We're very much at a parity there, and it's never been that way since. Technology is sort of, inclined upwards after that. Now it's almost impossible for people to escape as they did from anywhere without being seen by some sort of surveillance. But back in World War II, it was sort of right at the end of man-on-man defense and attack, sort of how do we get around each other. So I think it was like the pinnacle, and these stories really capture it. They are abridged, and they are written by a historian. They're not sitting down and talking with any of the escapees, I think, but they're a wonderful story of just sort of how all that sort of happened. And you can see yourself in there going, well, what do I do in that situation? Should I betray my fellow people in order to get some bread because we're all so hungry, or would I be one of the people that would go through and never betray anybody? Could I be underground digging that tiny little tunnel, for fear of collapse every second, all that sort of stuff. You sort of really put yourself in those shoes. What would I do as a guy in that situation? Could I do anything to get out? I think that was what sort of really struck me back in the day.
Those stories of courage, those ones. Was The Wooden Horse, was that an Eric Williams book?
It could have been, yeah. It might have. I'm not sure of the author. This is not the Troy story.
No,
The Wooden Horse, that would have been. Did I read that?
Yes. It was a gym, the wooden, they called it the wooden box, I think, but they called it the horse. And it was a gymnastics apparatus, and they would do flips and jumps and things off it. And all the time they were digging this tunnel underneath this wooden box horse.
I wouldn't be surprised if he wrote maybe a spin-off piece on that. But that's, if you can find that book too, then that one sounds excellent. The other series, which is, I've only got two here because those are the ones that I remember, although I don't quite remember the story. I just remember them being very engaging. And I read them probably in our early sort of homeschooling days, so it would have been around the time that I'm suggesting now. The series are by G.A. Henty, so there's a lot of books he's written. They're historical fiction, and rather than choosing to just describe an event, he creates a character and puts that character inside the event, and then walks the character through the event. And of course, it's sort of almost Forrest Gumpy. Sort of, he finds himself in locations where it's just irresponsible as a writer. You just wouldn't put him there, but you got to push the story forward and tell the whole story. So there the character was. The two that I have in mind, one is Under Drake's Flag. So Drake being, I believe, the British admiral who did a lot of excellent things in the Atlantic against both France and Spain. I could be getting my history mixed up there, but he was very important for the British state, and of course a guy with high agency. He sort of, let's go and do this thing. When he knew that the magistrate or whoever was coming down to stop him, he quickly left London to go and to go and do this thing, because he knew the campaign was more important than whatever the law was going to say. So off he went to go and do that, and by the time that he had left, he was outside of the ability for the state to stop him, but he actually ended up being quite an important character for the British, I guess, naval supremacy of the seas, basically. Britain rules the waves largely because of people like him. And the Young Carthaginian was another one, and I don't quite remember this story, but I'm only flagging it here as another example of a G.A. Henty book, and I'll let other people go and have a look. But that sounds probably have something to do with the Roman world, though I can't remember. I should have done a quick research to figure out what that was, but I just put that there as a second opportunity. My friends, when I was sort of in my 20s, he said his grandma reads this book once a year, and I was like, I gotta read this book. What is it? And so he gave me this book. It's called The Long Walk by Slavomir Rowich, and essentially this is in the 30s, or the 1930s, could even be earlier. The story is a biography. It's, when you read it, you'll know what I mean, but there are certain parts in there where you kind of scratch your head and go, did it really happen like this? But I'm not giving anything away. The long story short is he was a Russian dissident, or just caught up in the Soviet Bolshevism, sent away to a gulag in Siberia. He manages to escape, and he wants to obviously escape a lot further because they're racing behind him. So he walks south. He walks through, I think with a handful of other escapees, he walks through all kinds of different environments, eventually going through the Mongolian desert, up into the Himalayas, down through India, and eventually finds some help. But the whole story is just this pushback against the inevitable, which is the death by nature. Everything wants to kill him, from the cold to the heat to the thirst to the rivers, the snow, everything. And of course you got Russians chasing him as well. And it's just this effortful book of pushing past barriers, because you can see the other side. You know that there's going to be help. You don't know when the help is going to come, but it will be south. Just keep walking south. The Long Walk by Slavomir Rowich is very very Russian book. So there's a lot of clipped language, and his discussion of things is very Russian, but it's a great book to remember. So put that on your list. And the other, sort of slipping to genres here, going to sci-fi. I don't read a lot of sci-fi, which is ironic for someone like me because I enjoy politics. Sci-fi is actually just I guess a smooth way of talking about politics, your ideal political world without actually talking about it.
Sci-fi is.
Sci-fi is, yeah. It's what most good sci-fi authors end up doing, is creating a utopian world of how they think things should happen, and then just placing it in space. It's kind of, I'm being a bit cartoonish, but that's essentially what all good sci-fi is. The Ian M. Banks series, the Culture series, it's one of the ones I've read sort of in my 20s. There are 9 of them, but I've only read 4. But every single one I read is just so mind-blowingly expansive, and it's such a clean story. Like, there's not a lot going on that could traumatize a kid at all. It's I am watching out for that in this discussion. But consider Phlebas. The first book there are scenes in there that still capture me because of the way he describes things. And if, as a boy, you've played the game Halo, which I know most people my age probably would have, and depending on your interest in computer games now, you may not have. But a lot of the motifs, the Halo ring itself, the world of a Halo ring itself, actually comes from, consider Phlebas. That's one of the places they go to. Ian M. Banks invented that idea of like a ring world. And that was a lot of fun, that book. And he's done a handful of others. 3 others before I move on to the next set here. The Adventures of Pinocchio. This might be a surprising one for some, but it's a well crafted story. Clearly, it's not just written by Carlo Collodi. It's actually probably written by his whole village. At some point, it was one of those stories that they just told each other. It's packed full of metaphor, packed full of meta lessons and little analogies and ways of thinking about the world, the characters and the things that Pinocchio has to do and stuff. There's just a lot of lessons in there for young boys, because it's about a young boy who is a puppet and he wants to become a real boy. That's essentially, and it's kind of embarrassing to talk about like that, but it is actually a fantastic book. There's even discussion in there about finances and how to think about money correctly. There's stuff in there about what you should do, how to train your kid into thinking that it's a fantastic thing to follow the rules, but also bend them or break them sometimes, because as parents that can be a hard thing to teach. To train a kid to be comfortable in chaos but also respect order, and to have that Venn diagram sort of overlap sometimes. This story is just full of that sort of stuff.
In that sense, Pinocchio remains a relevant story, because you just said it sounds a bit silly, a puppet wants to be a boy, but there is a sense in which every person can remain this wooden puppet, if you like, of the state, never questioning anything, always being good and compliant, and never really learns what it is to break out of that and actually think for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So that bears thinking about as well. And I'm also mindful that Pinocchio is probably being corrupted in my mind by Disney forever, to the point where I would never have considered reading Pinocchio, but I think I'll put it on my list.
It's an easy read. It's also, it makes you stop after every handful of paragraphs and just look out into space. Do you know, when you have one of those moments when you're sort of like, I never thought of it like that. But you're not actually reading a story that's built for that. It's a tale. It's almost a fairy tale. But it's so full of, I've definitely had that in my life too. And I can see where Pinocchio is going in here. Yep, that's exactly what I thought would happen. But it's interesting how it happened. And could I have defended myself from that temptation, or that desire, that sort of lust for the worldly goods or whatever he got himself caught up in, which he keeps doing. And there's a lot of, you can wrap a lot of analogies and sort of life skills into a fictional character, but you can certainly see your life in there as well. It's also, again, another analogy for adolescence, as you say, growing up. So there are only 2 other series here, which I won't go into every single one, but just to cover them off. The Hardy Boys is probably where I started, by Franklin W. Dixon. He wrote, there must be a couple dozen, really, and they're almost pulp fiction. They're really tiny. You can read them sort of an afternoon, as I used to. And the local $2 shop or secondhand bookstore will have probably some sitting in some basket somewhere.
David, that was the series, The Author, where you fell into reading, quite literally, into this beautiful pool that you were never ever going to get out of. Up until then, reading was something that was required of you, but the Hardy Boys made you fall in love with literature and words and ideas and stories. And I used to say that I will be forever grateful for Asterix, Tintin, and the Hardy Boys, because that's where your love story with books began.
Yeah, it's the only way you can read above your level is to read above your level. That's essentially the way that goes. You start off with something that's interesting to you, but it may be the back of a shampoo bottle, but ultimately you keep going. And I did start off with those comics, so Asterix and Tintin. They're very easy stories to read. They're comics, obviously, or what you would call graphic novels, I suppose. There's a fine balance there. But then moving into the Hardy Boys was probably, obviously, the cover art is just very exciting for a young boy. They're always the two boys are always doing something crazy. Like there's some thing in the background. You're like, what's this story going to be? It's always well titled. Looking back now, the stories are probably formulaic in a way that there's something that happens close to them. They stumble upon a cache of money, whose is this or whatever, or they find a gun that's warm or something that's just gone off, so they have to go and figure out the story. And they're sort of independent young investigators, I suppose, little detectives on their own. And they obviously call the cops when they need to. They're not going out there to actually arrest people, but the whole story of trying to figure it out, again, high agency. These young boys see a problem or they're curious about something, so they go and investigate it, and that's sort of how the story sort of moves forward. And like I say, there's multiple dozens of these. There would have been 30 or 40 different books written. Fantastic series. I don't think I've read them all, but I've read certainly enough, and then wanted to keep going. I wanted to create sort of a Hardy Boys group around our neighborhood. So we created a handful of boys that would just learn about, we spied on the neighborhood essentially. We just had a lot of fun. Moving on from that is the Redwall series by Brian Jacques. Brian Jacques is a British author. All of his characters are small mammals or birds that are common in the UK. So you got rats, mice, hares, badgers, weasels, stoats, that sort of thing. And it's set in medieval times, or the equivalent of medieval times. So there's no weapons that are firearms. It's all just swords, pikes, daggers, bows, longbows, and that sort of thing. And it's this, broadly speaking, its core is around the good creatures, if you will. So the rabbits and the mice and the hares and the badgers and stuff. And then there's the bad creatures, so the weasels and the stoats and the horrible sort of the wolverines occasionally, or maybe even the corrupted hares who are sort of and of course no one likes rats. Of course you're going to place them as the bad guys, but it's the stories themselves are all sort of, it's a serial, but there's also a series. So each book is a contained story, but there is an overlapping arc of it's in this world. And Redwall, which is the foundational book, is a walled city, like a castle, and it gets invaded by, or has a siege by, I think it was, his name was Clooney the Rat, with all of his horrible rat and weasel and stoat army that was coming. And Martin the Warrior, who is the protagonist in that, has to defend the castle. And of course it's just a classic siege story. Well, I won't tell you if he's successful, but Martin the Warrior does appear later on, so he must be successful. And there's, again, like Hardy Boys, Brian Jacques was still writing books by the time that I grew out of them. But I collected most of them, and they're just beautiful books too, with a beautiful gold spine, and most of them were paperback that I bought, but they were still beautiful, and they were dog-eared to hell. I would have read them, would have been over and over again, but they were just good fun books. And because they were written in the form of, with the protagonists as being animals, you didn't need to assume any prejudices. The bad guys were bad guys because they were rats, and the good guys were good guys because they were mice and nice cuddly creatures. But the author Brian Jacques could then overlay into it clear political things or sociological problems or just clean storytelling and analogies. And you as a reader, because you weren't dealing with people, you could sort of bypass any prejudices, and I did kind of enjoy that. So, but that's the list for 8 to 12-year-olds.
Before we go on to teen boys then, and thank you for that, it couldn't have been easy to pick a representative amount from the enormous amount that is available for good books. So that was pretty good. So why for young boys then is it important for them to read exceptional books, or if they have trouble reading, to be read to, or to be read to is actually a beautiful activity in itself. But if we focus on the why is it important for them to be exposed to good stories like that, why do you think?
I think as a parent, you can appreciate that every young child is essentially a barbarian who needs to be civilized. And I guess all men and women at some extent reach a certain level of civilization and never rise higher than that. But how high you get them is how high you push them, I suppose. And, the good schools a long time ago, there may still even be a few around. I know homeschooling is sort of, coming into that vacuum. They tend to build not just knowledge, which knowledge for knowledge's sake is basically a calculator, and that's very, very boring, but knowledge for character development and building. So you're actually creating not education, but you're actually developing the adult, or you're developing the granddad, or you're developing the lawyer, or you're developing the family man while they're 6 or 7 years old. You're thinking that far ahead. What sort of skills, knowledge, appreciation of the world, agency level should someone who's 36 with 3 kids, a good job and an important position in society need? Well, here's how you start at 6 or 7, moving on.
Good books.
Good books
really
is a piece of
books.
that, because it alludes to what I talked about earlier, saying that you can't live all those lives yourself, and neither has your teacher probably, or your parents. So the way that you inject all that information into your head is by exposing them to people who have lived those lives, or who have written in a characterized way, a fictional way, about an idealized form, an idealized character. And then you can learn what the ideal looks like, essentially, what the pinnacle looks like. And then if you know what that looks like, and if you fall slightly short, you'll still be a lot higher than anybody else was. That's probably the core reason to do it. One, you don't have enough time to do it yourself, but you're not just training the boy, you're creating the man and the granddad and the father.
That's a really good answer. It's more than just giving the child a very good book because it's a good book and he will learn something. You're looking down the decades into his life. I love that you're investing in that future man, granddad. All right, good time to go straight into the teen books.
Yeah, so I've chosen again arbitrarily the ages 13 to 18, but this could be 13 to infinite, essentially, because, like I say, the cutoff point before I began the last series was adolescence, I suppose. So you're sort of talking about boys reaching a point where they are thinking about wanting to go out in the world, stir the pot, and become something. If they don't, then they're not going to get a girl, essentially. That's the ultimate reward for most guys, even if they don't think it is, or if they've grown so old that they can't remember what it was. And again, in no particular order, although I have sort of split it sort of into two. I think I start off again. You brought back a series. I had no idea about it. My cousin in down country actually told me that she was reading it at the time, and I sort of put it in my mind. And I think you've picked it up, and so you brought it home, and I read them all. There's a series of 7 books called the Tomorrow series, and Americans may not have been exposed to this, but it was really great for me. I would have read it about sort of maybe 13, 14. I don't know. It was early on. Started reading it then. They had been out earlier to that. It's set in Australia, written by an Australian man called John Marsden. The overall story, there's 7 books, so it's quite a long story. But the overall story is a group of teenagers go into the Australian woods for a camp. Now, they all know each other. They're from the same small town. While they're in camp, Australia is invaded by a foreign country. It's never actually clarified who or what country invades Australia. But when they get back after their camp, they find that their town is basically empty, and they have no idea what's going on, so they have to go and figure it out. Once they realize what's going on, they decide in only the way that teenagers can, that they need to fight back in some way. So they become basically a guerrilla force, and they're learning a lot. They're making mistakes, but the occupying force thinks they've got the whole town, and they don't realize that they're actually some stragglers, and it happens to be these, I think it's 5 or 6 of them, maybe a few more, and they've all got their own personalities. Again, they're teenagers, so they're dealing with, some of them fall in love with each other. It's actually written from the perspective of Allie, who is a girl, obviously, but it's a male author. So it's hard sometimes for a male author to write as a girl because they've not been one. So it's very rare for a really good male author to actually encompass a female protagonist accurately. So you end up having, this girl thinking like a guy in a lot of places, and of course he's just living through her, like what would I do if I was in this situation. But like I say, it's a series of 7 books. It gets more and more complex. Eventually New Zealand helps out, but for whatever reason, I remember America can't help out. He's just sort of made it so that there's some international law that says America can't help out, which would absolutely not fly in the real world. But it's a great sort of series about sort of what every guy, I think, sort of imagines, like, what would I do in that situation? Like, you walk into a shopping mall and you just have this fantasy of, like, if there's a terrorist in here, what would I do right now? I think every dude can sort of resonate with that. They've all thought, what would I do if something really bad was to happen right now? And this is the ultimate story of that. And if you don't need to know Australian slang or Australian culture and stuff. It's universal. This is kind of, young teenagers fighting back against, and with no adults around. They have to pretend to be adults in like real combat situations, and it's a lot of fun. Another classic, which most people will know about, is Lord of the Rings. I have gone straight for Lord of the Rings rather than The Hobbit because I don't actually think Hobbit is a very good story. It's a kid's story, but it's if you've read it as a kid, you probably don't really need to read it again. Lord of the Rings, however, is extremely layered. There's a lot going on. It's not necessarily just a fantasy story. I think the Ring of Power actually is just what it says it is. It's about power, why it resonates for me so much. The book, the actual story, and what power does to different kinds of people as metaphors for something else. So Gandalf to me represents science, and he is very much adamant that if you give the Ring of Power to science, you will get some nasty stuff, as we saw during COVID. That's what can happen. Aragorn definitely is a metaphor of the military, and if you give the Ring of Power to the military, they never give it back. There's always another crisis that they have to use power for, or some exception. And then the hobbits themselves are sort of collected as an ideal form by J.R.R. Tolkien, who didn't really have any mythological beasts in Britain, so he had to create his own ones, and they are the hobbits. And they sort of have this metaphor of the person that doesn't want power is precisely the one you should give it to, because they will not only give it up, but they will actually make the more rational decisions, because they don't have a lust for it. But the alternative of that is Gollum, who is a corrupted hobbit, who did succumb to the power, or the temptations of power. And there's so much more going on there. I would also link that to another book, which came out in, I think it was the 1980s, so a long time after Lord of the Rings was released. It's called The Last Ringbearer. And most people wouldn't have heard about this book. It's sort of in the periphery, but it's written by a guy named Kirill Yeskov, and he grew up in the Soviet Union. He'd never read Lord of the Rings until he came to the West. He picked up Lord of the Rings and read it, and he immediately got suspicious, because in the Soviet Union, the story of, or the narrative of why the Bolsheviks took power, or why the USSR was the greatest in the world, and why America was horrible in the West and stuff, was all made up. They had created this narrative about why they should have power. So when he read Lord of the Rings, he immediately thought, I wonder whose perspective Lord of the Rings is from. Because the orcs in Lord of the Rings are portrayed as these just irreproachable, you can't help them, ugly, grotesque beings that no one ever in the story feels any compunction about killing. They just kill them, and they're just bad creatures to the core. Well, that sounds like propaganda, said Kirill, because that's the sort of story you tell yourself if you are justifying slaughtering people who you don't like, because that's what he saw in the Soviet Union. So the last ring bearer picks up at the end of Lord of the Rings, once all the story has sort of closed off, and he uses narrative license to sort of discuss why some of the presentations of the story of Lord of the Rings might have been twisted by the people who, victors write the history sort of philosophy, and it builds off there to a different story. And without giving anything away, the reason why Lord of the Rings happened in Kirill's perspective is because Mordor itself was actually industrializing. It was moving away from the ancient traditional world where the kings and the powers, the people who actually controlled the world, were the magicians and the priests and the wizards and that sort of thing, the people who controlled the magic. And they were jealous of the power that was being created in Mordor, which was more scientific. And that's why there was a war. So it's all completely non-Tolkien, but it's an interesting corollary to The Lord of the Rings, because it does, I think, reading those two things one after the other, or maybe contemporarily, it's certainly, it's not literature. It's not, he's not a great writer. But I put that in there because Lord of the Rings is a fun standalone story. You can learn a lot from it, but attaching it to The Last Ring Bearer gives you, I think, a better appreciation of how the world really works. And I think so it's worth it for that. But don't get me confused, it's not literature.
Okay.
Moving on from there, I Am Legend is a short story by Richard Matheson, which is, again, stuck in my head. It's a great story for young men as well. It's essentially, there's a movie created from it, which was Hollywoodized, and don't even bother. And I mean, it has some cool scenes in it, but other than that, it's not the story. Again, this is important for sort of men growing up. Everybody hears about vampires as being the bad guys. But what if the world was full of vampires and there was just the last human left? How would the vampires think about the humans? Would they be scared? Would they have vampires only come out at night, but humans can come out at daytime? So they've got these day walkers walking around, and maybe they see some vampires and they just kill some vampires because humans, that's just what humans do. Well, what stories would the vampires create about that crazy human that they know lives in the daytime? And this is from the perspective of the last human, after a disease has gone around and basically turned everybody into vampires. And so from the perspective of I Am Legend, which is, I can't remember the character's name, but Richard Matheson basically looks outwards from the perspective of the victim and the person that the majority is making the legends about. And I think it's just quite interesting, because we do sort of look at the world and history and we create our own myths and legends and stuff, but we sort of always never ask the question, well, what is a Cyclops? Well, what is a Minotaur? Were they actually, just like the orcs from Kirill Yeskov's story, were they actually as horrible as we say it was? Or were we just making up justifications for what we wanted to do with them because we were scared of them? And I Am Legend really digs into it. It's a short story. You could say it's a horror, but it's in the horror genre, but it's written a long time ago. And it's more in the realm of H.P. Lovecraft, sort of. It's very fantastical, but it really digs into the psychology of being the victim, or turning the tables and seeing it from the other side, which, as every adolescent knows, you probably aren't going to be the quarterback or the top striker in a soccer team. You're probably going to be just a normal boy, and so you're probably going to be victimized at some point, even bullied. And this is a great book to sort of detach and look at yourself from a different perspective. Next book I have here is literature. It's called A Separate Peace by John Knowles. It is a book about a boarding school and two boys in it. One is a gregarious, extroverted, everybody likes him sort of boy. And the narrator himself, or the protagonist, is not that. He's not a parasite, but he's not a borderline personality either, but he just needs a friend like that. And sort of they become close friends. And the book it weaves in such colliding tales between these two people. One, obviously the gregarious extroverted person everyone likes and stuff, doesn't quite see the other boy, but the other boy, the narrator, the one who's more shy, sees the other guy in his vision the whole time. And so it's this almost truck and trailer sort of movement, and then jealousy and envy occurs because one of them can't see the other, doesn't appreciate the other, and there's so much that goes into it, and it's about just boys. And I figure that probably John Knowles may have been writing himself into one of these characters, although I'm not sure which. But this is a really good book. I think if you're probably between sort of 15 to 18, probably it would really help. Again, beautiful literature.
Have you said what the title of that is?
Yeah, A Separate Piece. And another good literature book would be The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. Again, very old. This is sort of before not very old, but sort of very early 20th century. And it's just the classic investigator sort of beat cop. A damsel walks into the office and says, "Hey, I've got this, something's been robbed, can you help me?" "Well, I'm not sure, dame." He's got all this sort of language, and it's a big adventure story looking for something that's been robbed from this girl, the Maltese Falcon. He's got to try and find it on behalf of. But the process and the adventure they go through, again, it's very much of its time, and you can get a sense of, I think it's set in New York or Chicago, one of those two, and it's just a romping good story. But so that's a Maltese Falcon, The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. Moving on from that would be Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. This is more of a journalistic story, but the reason I bring this up is because Jon Krakauer wrote it because he found a story of a man called, I think his name was Chris, and I can't remember his surname, but he was a real teenager who was just enamored by Thoreau and the book Walden and all of the old sort of very deep American idealists, and he never wanted to follow his dad's path of becoming a career-driven person. So he eloped himself. Basically, he just left the relationships that he had and just went out to go to Alaska. And he took nothing with him. He sold everything. And it's a real story of this boy Chris. And so he's probably in 18, 19, 20, sort of that sort of age in real life. This is a real story. And Jon Krakauer follows the breadcrumbs of where this boy went and talks to the people that he engaged with, and what sort of man was he, what did he do, where was he going next, how did you help him, did you help him, what impression did he leave on you, all that sort of stuff. So he's weaving this tale in, and it's not hidden, but the boy found himself in a bus out in the wilderness. He was on his way to Alaska, and he'd just gone out, and I think it was a handful of weeks in where he ate the wrong berry. He had, what berries to eat, what mushrooms not to eat, that sort of stuff, but he made the wrong mistake. Well, he made a mistake, and he basically died of dehydration out in the wilderness. No one around him. He just died alone. And that's the bus itself, where his body was actually found, became a huge tourist attraction after this book sort of came out. They made a movie of it too, which I thought was actually quite good. But the story is quite intriguing, because you have this narrative that young guys have is, well, success looks like this, and if you follow the right path, you'll find success. And most guys kind of have a skepticism of that, because one, we kind of want to do it on our own. We don't really appreciate what parents and grandparents tell us, but and then at some point we figure out maybe they were kind of right in certain ways, but also they were kind of wrong to stop us from going on that adventure and just going off to Alaska, metaphorically, like this boy Chris did. But there's also this sense that he was just completely detached. He really did have a dream. It didn't really matter about what the career was. Dad wanted to be a lawyer and wanted to get some sort of white shoe firm in New York, but he was great grades and everything, but just didn't want to do it. And he was just enamored by, like I say, Henry Thoreau and the writings of those idealists. And he was just a great kid to be around, according to all the people that he engaged with. And there's just this idea of, I want to go to Alaska and nothing will stop me, and I don't need money for it. I just want to get there. That's a metaphor in itself. And I really enjoyed the book because it sort of plays into that desire that I think a lot of guys have to go to your metaphorical Alaska, wherever that is. Some guys have that. It's not wanderlust. It's more than that. It's an adventure story in the middle of the 80s or the 90s. I think it was the 90s when this happened. So everything had been explored. I mean, there's no real place like in H. Rider Haggard, where you can go into the center of Africa where no European had ever stepped before. The world is pretty much cartographized. I mean, but he goes into the wild, like his own Alaska is somewhere that he's never been before. And I think that's kind of nice to capture, that you can still do that. Even though it was tragic and he did die, the effort matters more. And John Krakauer is a great journalist, and he wrote really well on that. Moving on to my favorite book, probably of all time, is Overworld by Larry Kolb. So the reason this is my favorite book is because I'm a big sucker for spy stories. More than that, just the world of intelligence just fascinates me, and I've always picked up as much as I can to read about that. So I know more than anything else, I know a lot about that world, as much as you can know, because it's a bit of a cliche that of course you can't know anything about a spy unless you are one. But Overworld is different. So Overworld, Larry Kolb himself, it's kind of semi-autobiographical. I'm not sure how much of it is fanciful, how much of it is licensed, and how much of it is real. But his dad served in the OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA. He also was point man in Korea and used to get people out of Korea and East Asia. And so he was the kind of the fixer guy. And he would always have intelligence officers or other interesting people come through his house. And so Larry Kolb, when he was growing up, used to listen to all these conversations and sort of be involved in them without anybody noticing. And sometimes his dad would sort of invite him in. He didn't really want to be in the intelligence services growing up. He just wanted to be his own man. But when you're in that world, even peripherally, you can't get out of it. And he sort of found that he knew too much already when he was a young man. And so he tried to create businesses where he, didn't get involved in that. He found himself in situations where he was basically not groomed to be a spy, but he had the mindset for it. And into his life comes the founder of the CIA, called his name was Miles Copeland. He was a real person, as was Larry Kolb, assumedly. And Miles realizes that Larry Kolb is actually in the perfect position a lot of times for him to use as an asset. There's a big difference between an intelligence officer and intelligence agent. And the intelligence officer in this sense was Miles Copeland. The intelligence agent was Larry Kolb. So Larry Kolb he had this business where he would invite high flying dignitaries or VIPs to go play golf. That was one of his first businesses. And Miles realized that was actually a really fantastic way to get important people in the same room together doing something like golf where it wasn't suspicious. So that was just the first piece of the puzzle. And Larry and Miles find themselves in some of, I think, the 70s, some of the highest intrigue stories that were real. So, the problems in Lebanon, problems with the Shah in Iran, in America, messing up elections in India, real CIA stuff, but right on the tip of the spear. And he meets all of these people who are just larger than life characters, but who actually exist. And maybe not their names are real because he's probably redacted their names, but they're all of them, all the people he meet are doing things that in international relations are always done behind the curtain. You can't see them, but they're the things that actually push the boat forward, not big meetings in the UN or speeches in the White House or meetings between heads of state. It's in the mezzanine, it's behind the stairwell, it's in the hotel room, it's discussing in the taxi on the way to the airport. These things push the world forward, and he's right in the center of it. And I try to read it at least every year, but every other year I sort of try and read it, see if I can pick something else out of it, or to compare it to what I know about the world since then. And I think it's just a great benchmark for that sort of thing. So if you want to sort of, as a boy, sort of want to understand or get a good snapshot of how the world actually works, you do worse to start there. And it's just a fun story as well. And again, I'm not sure how much of it is redacted and real, but a lot of it seems to comport with the way I understand how the world works. So he's done a really good job, which is why I keep going back. A similar book to that, which sort of stays in my head, is called Extreme Risk by Chris Hunter. He was an explosive ordnance disposal expert in Iraq. So this is the guy that when someone says there's a bomb on the side of the road, they call him in and he diffuses it. And this is one of those stories that will get you as close to high stress situations as you can without actually being in one. He's actually a good writer. It's not literature, but it really takes you to those situations because he was the guy that they used to call him. He was the guy that eventually taught other people how to defuse these sorts of bombs. He was the UK's leading EOD expert for a long time, special forces, but a really fantastic guy, and of course in real combat situations. And it's not, you really get a sense of how dangerous the global war on terror actually was for most people in those situations, not just the combat troops. Someone like him who was sort of on the edge, he was really important. That's Extreme Risk by Chris Hunter. Going back to sort of a bit of literature, I would say probably until he died a handful of years ago, I would say Cormac McCarthy was probably, he and Nicholson Baker were probably the top living authors in America. Nicholson Baker is eccentric, but he has a lot of fun. But Cormac McCarthy, his economy of storytelling, he can describe a whole year of a story in 2 paragraphs and you wouldn't miss anything. His ability to describe and take you to locations, to move through the story at pace but without missing anything, was unparalleled, and he was just fantastic. I think that if I could, the Horses trilogy is fantastic, but you wouldn't want to probably start there as a reader of his. I would say you start with The Road. The Road is a short book. It's a hard read, but it's basically set in the post-apocalypse where something's happened, and a man and his son are moving somewhere, just towards the sea, just to get out of the heartland of America, because everything is post-apocalyptic. And it's kind of, I think even as a young man, to sort of put yourself in the shoes of a desperate father is probably an education in itself. And Cormac McCarthy does a really good job of capturing the feeling of bereft. You have nothing left except this kid. You'll do anything to help it. And you kind of want to put yourself in the shoes of your dad, like what changed in his mind when he had you as a kid the first time. Because whenever you talk to a father, they always say, my whole world is now focused on this one kid. I used to have interest over here, but it's just this one kid. Well, this story dials it up to 11, so to speak, without wanting to be too cliche about that. And it's just it's a harrowing story. It's not gruesome, but I think it helps empathize with whatever your dad's going through, I suppose. And
it's not a story often told. No,
it's hard to tell, I guess, if you've. He's obviously making it up. It's post-apocalyptic, and it's a horror story, so to speak. But it does help you empathize, I suppose, to that extent. A bit more of a light-hearted story, but again, going back to what does this actually tell you about the world, and good for boys as well, is World War Z by Max Brooks. And you might sort of shrug at this and say, it's, pop fiction and whatever, but actually, Brad Pitt was in the movie, and it was a good fun movie, but the book itself is essentially premised on the idea that there was an outbreak that turned most of the world's population to zombies. No one quite knows how. I don't think that's actually explained. But at some point, the humans win, and there has to be a history of what happened. And so this is the history of what happened. And so every chapter goes through a different approach to that crisis at some point in the crisis. And he's almost like a journalist historian. It's all fake. He's making the story up. But there are a whole bunch of different stories about how people would react to enormous crises like this. And most of them are from a guy's perspective, but some of them are so high level and so imaginative that he's probably done a lot of research into, what would the UN do in this crisis situation? What would the army do in that? So he's gone really deep into some sort of minutiae details, but he's put it in the eyes of these random characters and sort of painted the picture of the zombie crisis itself, but how the humans sort of escaped out of it. And it's just a really fun book to read. And if you're in New Zealand, there is a mention of New Zealand towards the end of it. Most of the big battles happen in America, as you can imagine, because Max Brooks is an American himself. And of course, that's the center of the gravity of the world at the moment. But that's a fun book to read. Again, it's sort of it realizes or makes real the zombie stories. It goes beyond sort of the crazy sort of stuff and just sort of puts it into the real world. And I think that's quite a fun one. And again, we're moving towards the sort of the teenage years of reading this sort of stuff. So you're a bit more attuned to reading that sort of stuff at that point. A different kind of book, but I guess in the same sort of vein, is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I see Cormac McCarthy and Nicholson Baker were the two best fictional authors living until, I don't know if Nicholson Baker is still around, I think he may be. But if I had to put one of the best authors of the 20th century into the and find, I think Tim O'Brien would probably be, he'd have a good candidacy for it. He didn't want to be a writer, didn't want to, but he's written a number of books now. What really put him on the map, though, was the things they carried, because he fought in Vietnam, and his ability to remember details that are really emotional and gripping about his time there. I think a lot of his stories are apocryphal. Some of them are definitely his experiences, or maybe his platoon's experiences, his multiple platoons. I think he had a couple of tours over there. And he was a volunteer, or I guess conscripted. He didn't want to go to war either, but he certainly wasn't. He didn't join the army for want of it. But his reflections on that they all take you to little patrols, or times in the barracks, or when they're billeted in someone's house, or when they're waiting on leave, or when he's writing a letter to his, and they take you to situations. And I don't think I've ever been transported into a place where I almost could smell it better than the things they carried. And it's a fantastic book. He's written a few other ones as well on that time, and also prior to that time. But when he was basically just a teenager, or early 20s, so everything is raw for him. And so Tim O'Brien, I would say that Dispatches by Michael Herr, which is another one I've got here, is a similar vein. If I could put those two together, Dispatches by Michael Herr and Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, there's sort of, both of them deal with the Vietnam War, and they take you there as a patrolman with a machine gun in the forest, looking underneath a rock to find a hole where the Viet Cong is with a gun pointing at you. They take you to a grenade explosion that kills your friend, all this sort of stuff. It's just, those two books are just amazing. So
those two books, I'm just, because obviously me not being a male, I'm sitting here thinking, is that a good literature book? But
I think my metric here is creating men, I suppose. There's lots of literature you could read that teaches you, or that are good books, but very few get to the rawness of sometimes of real men, what men go through in real life. And I think war is one of those things that defines guys. Like, there's only been a handful of wars in actual human history that have been fought strictly by conscripts. War is fun. It was, in a bizarre, paradoxical way, war is an enjoyment for men. They do it because it is. They wouldn't do it otherwise. They wouldn't be. There's something about it as enjoyable. To understand that paradox is to understand masculinity in a way. And you can read about Alexander the Great, and we'll get to Plutarch shortly. But I think the contemporary stuff, kind of the war that we've had since World War II, has just been so brutal when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, that it really does take that, are we doing this for fun, to a real question mark at the end of that. In the archaic world, the classical world, medieval time, Renaissance, so those sorts of areas, even up to the industrial age, you could still be a noble, train all your life, go off to war, and come back and have a story. These days, you could be the highest born person with all the world ahead of you. You go off to war, you could be killed by a mine tomorrow for nothing. It's the carnal house, the machinery of war just makes it just so ridiculous now that it's kind of important to separate the two eras of, like, pre-industrial war to post-industrial war, which is what we're in now. And so I think these stories really capture the really question that idea of, are we really doing this for fun now? Is this still fun, guys? Because of the realities of even Iraq and Afghanistan, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia at the moment, the realities of war these days is it's not fun anymore. And I think sort of someone needs to capture that, and those two guys really did that quite well.
So in the sense of bringing those things into an educational, a homeschool situation, what I'm thinking is that the homeschool parent, probably the mother, because it's her that usually selects for the child, is best in this case just to trust you with, you need to teach your boy, your young man, about the world, that which is to come, that he needs to go into. They might not be in your reading list of you're going to teach them history and that involves war, but to include these books as well. That's what I think I'm getting out of this, is that 20 years ago when I was in the situation, I'm looking for books for my son who's in his mid-teens. I would have wanted to sit down like this and go, it doesn't really make sense to me, I don't understand it, but I'm going to trust you in what you're recommending.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, boys need to grow into men, and they have decisions to make at that point which can color the rest of their lives. And as some men make a good decision to go into, say, military world, or into legal world, or wherever they decide to go, but the career they choose, it should be based on clear-eyed, rational understanding of what that entails. And I think a lot of, just staying in the military world, recruiters and veterans and stuff will sometimes paper over the realities. They might say things like, it's 1% horror, 99% boredom, blah, blah, blah. And you can kind of go, oh, well, that kind of sounds like my office job sort of thing. You could make that mistake. But I think it's important for boys to be exposed to not horror and gratuitousness of, say, Hollywood, where they're just showing you someone get shot and their head blowing off or whatever, because that you can get desensitized to that. I think what they need to read is from people who found themselves in a place that they couldn't get out of. It's not fun anymore, but they survived. And the reality here is, yes, we had a lot of agency and we were doing things, we were told to do stuff, but it was, we may have made the wrong choice at some point. And it's not peacenik stuff, because that was very 70s as well. Tim O'Brien and Michael Herr, they were realists about how the world really worked. It's just, I think most of why they wrote this book was they wish they would have had to read something like this, because I think they would have fought a lot harder to stay out of the army and to campaign against that sort of stuff. But war is not fun from that perspective, especially when you're at that grunt level where you sort of have to just go out and clear a village and stuff. I guess the more professional combat these days probably takes you out of that, but even talking to special forces, it doesn't sound like it's all that interesting as well. I mean, it probably is still fun, and you get that attraction. It's just, I think it's important for boys to read the rawness of it in a way that isn't historicized. This army moves this army over here and they clashed in the middle and 30,000 were dead. That's so 30,000 foot view, helicopter view of things, that doesn't really take you down to it. And then you can talk about the stabbings and how weapons work and stuff, but that's really mechanical. This is fiction's biography, autobiography, all wrapped into one. And it's just important to point those out, I think. I'll skip that one, only to say The Stranger by Albert Camus was a really good, it's a philosophical treatise in a fictional form, and it's a classic, and I don't really have a lot to say on it, but it's important to put that in there. I'll skip to Dune by Frank Herbert. Now, I read this twice, one when I was younger and didn't really click, and one a handful of only years ago, because I knew the movies were coming out and I really like the director, so I thought I'd reread it again. I'm glad I did, and I'm kind of annoyed that I didn't read it with more composure when I was younger, because Dune is, again, sci-fi, but it's not really. It's actually more political, and I've written about it many times, but the story actually is from Jessica's point of view. Jessica's the mum, and this is it's an interesting addition to this list, because Dune isn't necessarily from Paul's perspective, who's supposedly the main character. What you're actually reading with Dune is how women look at men, or deal with, or can't quite understand, or get on the same level with, resonate with men of high agency. Men who are fated to do something big, who become something, who work towards that, who go through the trials and tribulations of becoming. And it's such a head scratcher for women, because they aren't men, and they don't get that opportunity a lot, if ever, to actually become something more than just their body. They are just born into whatever they have often, which is not just how society operates with them, but just often how they are, how femininity is. But for masculinity, it is a result of what you become. And so having a story like that, which is highly political, and to be honest, a lot of agency and direction in it as well, from the perspective of females, is a curious thing. And I really appreciated Dune for that. It's a long book. I haven't read the whole universe because apparently it just gets kind of silly. But people who have said it's great, and but Dune is definitely up there as from a perspective of, obviously Paul is high agency, but think about what you're doing, or as a young man from female's perspective, and you can probably get a better appreciation of certain things and your blind spots and whatever. So Dune is good for that. The last handful I want to sort of move into is aren't fictional and aren't science fiction or fantastical. They are more things I wish I would have read when I was younger that have really helped me as an adult. But as I say, I wish I would have read them. Top of that list is Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World by Rene Girard. Now, Rene Girard he kind of died in anonymity a little bit in, I think, 2007, 2008 or somewhere around there. Since then, and you could say prior to that, but in certain academic circles he was well known. But since then, his description of the world, he's an anthropologist, so that's kind of where he starts, has gained more traction amongst people who kind of want to see the world differently and to see how it actually operates and what you might do in that situation once you know it operates. There's a whole podcast we could do on Rene Girard that I could actually lead quite well because I've read most of his big stuff now. But just to say that everything else you read in all of these stories, I think one of the reasons that they're good or not, to answer your question from before, is whether they have the really fundamental conflicts between people correctly described, and how those actually play out. The conflicts between why people create friction between each other and why violence occurs is a constant theme across all fiction that's never really engaged in fiction. It just happens. There's a bad guy over there. We need to go and fight him. Okay, Rene Girard unpacks, but why do you think he's bad? Where did that feeling of animosity come from? And really wraps that back into all of the systems and institutions we have today, and describes things in just ways that will, I hope, blow your mind and hopefully correctly orient you to how things are actually happening now, so you can appreciate them better. Start with that one, or Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. Two books which are related but distant from each other in terms of authorship, but great for especially a teenage young man. First is The Manipulated Man by Esther Vilar. So Esther Vilar was roundly chastised by the feminist movement when she wrote this, because her entire thesis of The Manipulated Man is that it basically comes down to one question. As a man, can you describe any action that you take that isn't fundamentally about pleasing women in some way? And I've asked this question with my friends, and no one has ever been able to give me even one example of something that you do that isn't at bottom about making women feel better about themselves, or making women feel more safe, or pleasing them, or in some way. That's her premise. It begins from there, that the entire existence of men is to make females feel good, and how lots of the decisions they make in life about what to do next and what sort of career they have, if they want to have one at all, whether they should have a family, how much money they should get, what sort of person they should become, whether they should go to war, as we were just talking, all that sort of stuff. All of those decisions begin from that premise. And so when she painted this, it was completely anathema to, or I would say perpendicular to, what the feminists were saying. They were saying that, it's the females that are completely manipulated by the patriarchy. But she was saying, actually, the patriarchy's never existed. We've always lived in a matriarchy. Everything, and even the book Dune I just mentioned before proves this. Like that book is basically about a secret cabal of women who are in control of the universe, manipulating it to get their way and to bring into existence the Messiah, who's going to be a boy, but that they're going to control him. That's the entire premise of Dune. And Esther Vilar, sort of in The Manipulated Man, opens that to another level and discusses it in, I think, very, very clear ways, how she has actually felt quite, not sorry for men, but she's very apologetic about this the way that it is. And for a girl to say that is far different from an anti-feminist man to say it. And you just get that deeper gravity from it. You're just like, wow, and it's well reasoned, And it was, like I say, very unpopular at the time when she came out. She was roundly actually made into a pariah. I think she died alone, basically, before this. She's written a few other ones after that, but she basically disappeared after that. But it was fantastic. The corollary to that, which is basically I would say it's the distilled learnings of a worldwide scientific project that began in the 90s, ramped up in the 2000s, and sort of became formalized and written about by about people in the sort of the 2010s. This giant experiment was across the world was essentially a bunch of young guys going out to bars or going on dates and interacting with women, coming back on blogs or forums and writing about their experience. What did I learn? When I said this, did it lead closer to sex or further away from sex, basically? And there would have been tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of guys doing this in what became different masculinity communities and stuff. And one of the core people that collated all of this and formalized it into a series of books goes by the pseudonym Rollo Tomasi, and he wrote the books The Rational Male. And there's a series of things called The Rational Male, and there's subcategories and stuff. There may be 4 or 5 of these books now. But again, a book I wish I would have read as early as possible, essentially, because none of it is nasty. All of it is scientific, and all of it is based on real world experiments that actual guys have done to figure out not just how to get with women, but how they think. And this is essentially what magazines like Women's Weekly or Cosmopolitan have been doing for decades prior about men. How to manipulate a man into doing something you want or whatever. But this is just guys figuring out how women think and creating a book out of it. And it's I would say, regardless of your attitudes to this topic of dating or the topic of the male-female dance, this is fundamental. Every guy should read this as early as possible and keep it as an idea, because it's not just about learning how women think. It's actually learning how society moves. Because I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, the public is a woman. If you can woo her, you can get her to do what you want, or to love you forever, or if you fail, she'll hate you forever. The existence of a politician or a leader and their power depends on controlling the public's opinion. And if Chesterton is right and the public is a woman, you should learn how women think, because that can really help you as a politician. So it actually helps you from thinking from that level. It helps you in a lot of things that you end up doing, no matter what career you go into. It's just a matter of the people aren't necessarily machines, but they follow scripts in their own heads, and they may not even know what those are. And it's really just about introducing you to basic psychology, and especially women. And for guys, really important, especially if you see that cute girl at the mall and you want to go up and talk to her. Here's how to do it, for instance. That's just the very tip of the iceberg of what this book teaches you, and it'll change you from being scared to being courageous, which is the only way to defeat fear, is to become courageous instead.
Have you read Chesterton's What's Wrong with the World?
I haven't. You've told me about it. Yeah. One of my favorite authors, I've only got a handful left. One of my favorite authors is James Froude, who was writing in sort of the late 19th century. He was a fantastic historian. Again, talking about building of character and building sort of the men we sort of want to become. His book Caesar, A Sketch, is, I think, without parallel in terms of talking about the character of Julius Caesar, but also that sort of high point of Roman civilization. And he discusses who Caesar was, why he did things, like I say, his motivations, all the pieces around him. And then it's obviously it ends at his assassination, but you can see what he built. You can see why he did it. You can sort of, from what James Froude could understand from reading of history, he built this story about what man Caesar was, and how he did and why he did his thing. And I just think Caesar, A Sketch, you couldn't write any better book about that, about the high Roman civilization. It's just fantastic. Probably the hardest book I've ever read, not in terms of complexity, but just the subject matter, was The Eastern Front by Leon de Grael. In World War II, most people, it's because the Americans kind of won, we hear, and most of the stories are about the Western Front. But the Eastern Front was where the real war happened. Like the Americans, if I can be so brash and say, they didn't really fight in a war. I mean, compared to what was really going on in the Eastern Front, that's where the war really happened. Like there was no real battles. I mean, there was lots of, thousands of people were killed, tens of thousands of people were killed in the Western Front, but it was absolute brutality in the Eastern Front. Really gruesome stuff. It was really a race war. They really wanted to annihilate each other. Leon de Grael, some have suggested actually that the character Tintin is actually drawn from his character. Leon de Grael was a Belgian. He joined the Waffen SS, volunteered as part of the Pan-European force to fight on behalf of Nazi Germany, and was deployed over to the Eastern Front. Was involved in the whole push early in Operation Barbarossa, and the push all the way back to Berlin once the Soviets got their gear and got their head in the game and sort of pushed the Germans back. But he is a man of extremely high agency. He has fear, but his courage has beaten his fear. And he was one of these people that if the war came out differently, you'd know his name, because he was just he was high morals, high ethics, extremely high leadership. And from his perspective, all the places that he was during this war, very high luck as well. He's a fantastic person to read about, but also read from his perspective of what happened. And regardless of what you think about the war, the Eastern Front is a necessity to understand it, but also to understand how people who are like Leon, who basically the ideal soldier, everybody could see that. That's how they think. And if you want to achieve that, you should ask the question, am I like that? Because if you're not, probably don't try, because you're just going to be cannon fodder. There's a couple left. One of the best books I've ever read, which takes you right down to the footsteps of Hernan Cortez's push into ancient Mexico in the 1400s, was the book called The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz. I've actually read this just recently, but it's again one of those books that I wish I had earlier, because it is a first-hand account of the Spanish invasion of the Aztec Empire. And if you know anything about that story, you should immediately be salivating, because that's one of those moments in European history, or I say world history, where it was true exploration, true adventure. Like 600 or so guys conquered a civilization. Like we're talking millions of people in sophisticated civilization. Like they had communications networks, they had politics, they had weapons, they had military strategy. They were actually smart people in Mexico. 600 to 800 Europeans defeated it, and this is the story of on the ground with them. And it's The Conquest of New Spain by a guy who was actually there is fantastic. I think it's without parallel. There's nothing quite like it. If we still had a story of someone who was with Alexander, it might be in that same category. If we didn't have Caesar's Gallic Wars and him actually writing very sort of dispatchily, we've sort of created a lot of narrative license of what he did. We don't have any sort of stories of a soldier that actually served with Caesar. But if we did, it would be like this. I think Conquest of New Spain was amazing. The final book I sort of want to talk about is Plutarch's Lives. It's not one book, it's a series of, you can get different volumes. I've got a 6-volume set of Plutarch's Lives. The reason I want to keep this to the end is because this is the kind of book that classical education would feed their young men and keep them reading to create, in the sense, an ideal man in the future. Plutarch, this is writing in sort of the year 300 AD. He grew up in Chaeronea, which is in Greece. He was a Greek historian, extremely well read for the time. He wrote a whole series which actually ended up being, like I say, like a curriculum for people back then, and for years afterwards. His goal wasn't necessarily to write about certain men's accomplishments. What he did was he took a famous and important man in Greece, in Greek history, and compared it with a similar character in Roman history, and then showed you why in a third chapter. So one chapter for each, explaining who they were and what they did, and then he compared the two in a third chapter, and that's the formula he does as he goes through. there's about 20 or 30 different people that he actually compares, and some of them are lost to time, unfortunately, but we do have the remainder, so the large bulk is still around. The reason it's so important is because these are probably, in terms of historically, the men with the highest agency that's sort of ever been around. People who saw that they wanted to go and do things and did it. We are talking about Demosthenes, we're talking about Alexander, we're talking about Caesar himself, we're talking about a whole bunch of others who, in this time period, probably over 2,000 years or so, were just the pinnacle of men who went to do things and did them well. Some mistakes, admittedly, but they were extremely high agency, and you can learn. And they're not talking about their military conquests or their political escapades or anything like that. They're talking about what made them as men, why they were like this, and what made them so great, and what the comparisons were between the two, and if it's possible to teach this sort of stuff. And that's Plutarch's Lives. It's a long read. It's a good read for something written in 300 AD and then transliterated through French and then into English as well. But it's one of the ones, actually, once you get going, it's hard to put down, and there's a lesson on every single page. And I can definitely see why they used to teach this to kings and princes and generals, aristocrats, nobles. And as soon as the actual public got it, it was extremely popular when it was first translated, I think, out of the original Greek in like the 1500s. It was just everywhere at certain class. And everybody's reading it for a good reason. It really built people, and I think so. That's the one I want to end on. But that would be my list. As they got a little bit more complicated as I went down the list, but I sort of wanted to end with that because I think if you're going to sort of to have something to chip away at while you're reading all the rest of them, you definitely must grab a set of Plutarch's Lives.
Good investment to have.
Well,
a few thoughts then, just to wrap up. Listening to you and knowing you as well as I do, and overseeing your homeschooling years, it seems to me that the potential in what books can deliver, it's almost deceptively clever, because you can look at books and go, well, we've got to read this list here in order, and you've got to do a report on it in order to pass this grade here, and that's the purpose of the book. But there's a much, much deeper purpose, and I think as homeschooling families, it's really important to grasp that the importance of books. It's our privilege in the homeschooling life to invest in our children in this way, and especially for today, we're talking about our boys, because they are going to be the men who provide, protect. They're going to be the husbands and the fathers and the grandfathers, and especially mothers who oversee these years with their boys, to keep looking at that picture down the years. Know what your goal is. What is your purpose in curating the books for your sons? So there's that idea there. I had in the questions I was going to ask you about a ratio of good books to lowbrow books, but it's become fairly obvious from hearing you talk that when you have filled your literary life with quality books, you become quite a connoisseur as to what is worth reading and what isn't. So unless you can think of anything in particular to add to that thought.
Yeah, I think aside from what I mentioned before, this my own personal metric is usually books written prior to 1917 are superior to ones written after. That's just from my experience, and that's actually a hard-won experience. I would also say that you should probably, because there's so much books are out there, and I used to have a chief editor who I actually encouraged to write a book, and he actually dismissed it one day and said, there's already too many books. And it was a dismissal, but he's right. There's way too many books. Like I think there's like 30 or 40 different World War II books that are written every year. It's ridiculous. You can't get through them. And they're often just, treading over the same ground again. And publishing houses need to, make money, so they need to produce new books. And they're often, there's only, as Joseph Campbell said, there's only 7 basic formulas of fiction stories. So once you've sort of exhausted the 7, you kind of have to create new characters, but it's going to be the same formula. So after a while, it's not necessarily that you've read them all. It's just that you hit diminishing returns pretty easily. So the only other piece of advice I would give for choosing
Sorry.
the only piece of advice I'd give for choosing sort of quality books, I suppose, would be have a project, have something you are digging for, something that maybe you don't know what it is. You can kind of sniff it, but for me, I kind of want to understand two things. One is, as I said before, I'm extremely interested in anything to do with the intelligence world, which just so happens to encompass almost everything. So it's kind of hard to sort of make that as like a priority. But nevertheless, that does help me whittle things down. The second thing that I'm interested in is a very simple question: what is power? And so there's a lot of books that would fall outside that remit, which I'll just never read because they don't comport to answering that question. But anything that falls inside that question, or even might be answering that question, I'm extremely curious about. So it ends up actually being the list I've given you there, plus the hundreds that I've read in my book log, and the double hundreds that I've got in my bookshelf here, either waiting to be read or never will be read. But all of them are within a theme. I'm trying to figure something out. And I think academics can sort of approach this as well by having a PhD thesis or a master's that they've done, which is on a specific thing, to which they will always do lectures. It's about this thing, and so they're dedicated to focusing on a very tiny pinprick of knowledge, but they know a lot about it. For me, it's a larger question, but that keeps me looking at certain kinds of books. So I kind of, from there, if I work backwards from that question, there's a lot of genres that I look into. Some I just won't be interested in, like, I don't know, vampire fiction does nothing for me, for instance. I won't probably even bother reading it, even if it might be interesting. It's so far out my remit that I just don't even accept that it actually exists in the world in my head. And there's lots of books like that, but I think just in terms of the overwhelmingness of publications, you do kind of need some parameters, and you have to ask, can you break your question down into 3 or 4 words, and then follow through from that? I suppose that's what I've done.
The question of what books to read.
Yeah, what question are you actually trying to answer? Is there something that's very curious about? If you can distill that into a sentence, you work backwards from that, and all the books that fall into that sentence you can read. And from there, it's holistic, right? So you start reading something, then inside that will be something that piques your curiosity. So you chase that book down, and inside that there might be 5 things that pique your curiosity, and now you need those 5 books that sort of move from there. And it's a never-ending branch of sort of moving out, but the branch is a species. It's coming from a tree that's based on one question, or the thing that you're really interested in, whatever that may be. It may not be what I'm interested in. It could be something completely different. But I think if you're constantly digging for something, books will serendipitously find their way to you, and some authors will clue you into the direction over there. Go look over there under that rock or whatever.
Because when we go to these enormous book sales like the Lions or the Rotary, to know in advance before you walk through the door, because otherwise it's quite overwhelming, where does one start? But if you've got, like what you say, these projects in your head, these areas in your life that are important to you, that's going to be what you hone in on. And so you can pretty quickly, it's an automatic sifting process for a start.
Yes, and there's no reason you can't collect books either that you're not going to read, but are a good store of wealth. If you find something that is a first edition, or that ran out of publication and no one's doing it anymore, pick it up. You may not read it, but you have it on your bookshelf. So there's another motivation for collecting books is as a store of wealth. But I think the only real way you can approach reading is to have something you're trying to figure out. I have seen people walk out of secondhand bookstores with boxes of books that I just know they're not going to read, or worse, that they will, and it will just waste their time. They're just doing it to fill time, literally. And I think there are probably worse ways you can fill time, but to me that's sacrilege. There's so few minutes in the day and the rest of your life. Why would you want to waste your time reading John Grisham? Not to pick on John Grisham, but
It was interesting that you should touch on that, though, because in my list of ideas of things to talk about, I've got what's a good ratio of good books to lowbrow books, and we've talked about the definition of that, and I tend to think of it's a little bit like food. If you apply the 80-20 rule, you're probably going to have a reasonably good healthy life without eating in a very boring way. So if that was to go over to books as well, there are times when you're just going to end up reading something that's a little highbrow, if you're actually enjoying it, or at that point in your life you needed something that was a little bit low because life's been intense, it could serve that purpose in itself. But there's so much junk around that passes off as books, just like food, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have a saying in media that you need to give people a lot of chocolate before they'll eat their broccoli. You know, in the sense that you can't just have really heavy stories all the time. You can't need to have the almost the lean back and lead forward idea, where so the lean forward is very newsy, what's happening, what's now, and the lean back is more analytical. You've got a bit of time on your hands. You can read 1,200 words with the op-ed or the analysis. You've got time. You've got space in your head. But people kind of need both. You can't, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy is very real. You can, even if you have an interesting topic that animates you, that you're trying to search out, like I do, there's only so much of my what I call workbooks that I can read over a defined period of time before I feel not bored but just burnt out a little bit. I just I do pick it up. It is interesting. It is on my list. I do need to read it. I will find it fascinating. I just can't connect with it because I've had too much of it. I've had too much chocolate or too much broccoli or something. So I needed to balance it out. For me, that's when I shift to reading fiction, or I find a nice movie to watch or something, or I go back to a book that I've enjoyed in the past that I know that I'm going to enjoy a second time. And that's sort of it's a bit of I get like a breath mint. You're cleansing your palate and you sort of go back to the food later on. But on top of that, it's also important to do the other parts of reading to make reading more kinetic. You should be writing down notes. You should be, every time you think of something while you're reading it, write it down. Some sort of connection, some sort of universe has just spoken to you, sort of connection, write that down. That's why I don't really appreciate audiobooks, because listening is very different from reading, very different from writing. I find that when I read audiobooks or listen to lectures, I'll get to the end and I'll realize actually I don't actually quite know. Then I listen to it a second time and I realize how much I missed because I was doing something else, cleaning the house, or I was writing, or I was playing a computer game or something just to soak up the time. I realize how little I actually engaged with. But the way I read is to write as well with it, that I'm not reading a full chapter just in one go. There will be dozens of times that I'll stop and I'll write something down. So I'm constantly sort of, I guess you could say, exercising with the food I'm actually ingesting. And same with discussions. Like I will take pieces of the book and I will talk to somebody about it. And in the discussion, I'm literally exercising the muscle, as you say, and my brain isn't getting fat with the chocolate that it's been given. And so I think if you couple the reading with the discussion and the writing at the same time, the nutrients that you're getting out of the books will be absorbed into your brain better. You can't just expect to, unless you're a savant, you can't really expect to remember everything you've read just by reading. You need to engage the other parts of your learning mechanisms, I suppose.
I want to come back to audiobooks, ebooks in a minute, but I'd like to just stick to this idea, if you like, of writing down things as you're reading, because that's a slightly deeper level in the purpose of reading. I'm talking from a homeschooling perspective, that could possibly be encouraged in home education, as just get used to it even from a very young age. It might be a bit difficult for some of the younger boys, but they too have ideas that they can just jot down a quick idea. And it doesn't mean that they'll have to write an essay or a report or something like that, but just to begin collecting those ideas, because then I see it would have a really interesting outcome, that as the years go by, you can go back and look at those ideas you wrote down as an 8, 9, 10-year-old. I'm going to think about that a lot more and just create a podcast out of that by itself, because I think that's a gem from today. Thank you so much. That I wish I'd known about when we were homeschooling, because to write something down about it was often what we did later, unless I was giving you a narration exercise.
Well, it can feel like work when you're asking a kid to read this chapter and then tell me what you think about it, write it down or something. For young guys whose mind is just bouncing off the walls, everything's so exciting, they may have slight attention deficits or whatever the psychologists say. It's not fun for them to go. They would associate the work with the enjoyment of reading, and the enjoyment of reading would slip away as they sort of they contemplate the work involved. They're like, I'm not actually enjoying the reading anymore, which is such a shame. But I think for me, like, I don't necessarily, I actually refuse to write book reviews unless it's been a really, really good book and I found a great insight into it. I won't write book reviews because it's no one else's business what I got out of the book. I just, for me, it's me. And I'll loop in the ideas that I found in it, or the pieces of history, or the concepts and stuff, into things I write elsewhere. But I'm not going to sit down and tell you what I thought about it because it's a waste of time. You go read the book. You'll be subjective and you'll get something out of it as well. But all of the little nuggets that I find, all the ways it made me think, that may be just one sentence or sometimes a paragraph, if I don't write them down at the time, then it's not a feedback loop I'm creating in my head. It's not enjoyable. It becomes more like a work. The way I do it is, you got to strike while the iron's hot. When you get that piece of that lightning flash of insight, or that sentence really did stand out, and you translate that over into your notes or something, you have to do it right then. So it becomes this coordination game. You're reading and writing at the same time. And it may not look like you're actually doing a lot of writing, but if you collate it all up at the end, or after a couple of weeks, you're actually done quite a bit. Turn that into an essay. But don't think of it like, I'm going to write an essay. You're digging for something. You're finding gold. You're stacking all the little pieces that you get together, and all of them are interesting. And then one day you look back and you go, actually, that's a really big house I've just created. Come and join me in my house and I'll show you around all the rooms. This is what I've discovered. But I think if you can, especially with diligence, is hard for young boys. They sort of need to almost be taught how to be conscientious. And I think eating the elephant is, for an analogy wise, doing things in bits rather than, almost nobody has the discipline or the energy to just do the whole thing in one go. And so I think the earlier they can learn that, the better. It's definitely going to help them in their career. But it's something that you just create a feedback loop. As you're reading, you're writing. As you're reading, you're writing. And you enjoy both of them at that point. And then you can just do writing on its own at some point, because you just had a lightning flash that will actually last for 2,000 words rather than a sentence. But to sit down and actually want to write 2,000 words is tough. Even now I'm like, ugh, it's my job, but I don't, necessarily want to do it until I know how to do it, but I don't necessarily want to do it all the time. But if I'm constantly reading and writing at the same time, little bits of writing, you suddenly find you have quite a bit.
Quite a bit there, and it didn't seem like an effort when you go back and look at it again. So I think that the main point with that is putting it into a homeschooling situation, especially in the early years, is just learning that freedom and the prudence as the mum, is that it's not supposed to steal the joy of the book. There were times when I just said to you kids, just read the book. I don't require anything of you at the end of it. Just enjoy the book. And then there is one where I'd say, okay, choose a book that you read this term, and now I want an end of term test from you out of it. And that was a writing exercise. So it's getting the balance right is a contradiction in terms, because it's a juggling act the whole way through. But nobody in the whole world can do it as well as the mother, because she's the one that knows the child so very well. So we'll leave that idea there. Now, going back to audiobooks, and now I'm going to include ebooks as well. It wasn't really a thing when you kids were young. We could get books on tape. Remember those? That I would give to you if you were going to sleep, or we'd play in the car. But they were an optional extra. Now it seems to me, anyway, looking from the outside in, the modern homeschooling family now have all these choices, and I do wonder if there is just the ease factor coming in that we even would call it a hard copy now. It used to be the only version, a book, it's it. But now you refer to a hard copy or an ebook or an audio book. How to choose? Is a hard copy book still the superior manifestation of a piece of literature? When does an audio book or an ebook become equal? Is it ever equal, or are they just secondary? I'm just thinking out loud now, because I think we're just coming to the end of that first generation that had no data to go on. We don't know yet whether that's so. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure, yeah. I think it's one of those questions that you kind of need to start with at first principles. Like if Plutarch had the internet and audio microphones, would he have written his book, or would he have made it into an audio book or an ebook? Like, what is the actual ideal form of passing down knowledge. We've only had the written word for thousands of years, but prior to that, we were telling stories verbally because we didn't have the written word. We would tell stories across the campfire. So audiobooks actually aren't new; they're just formalized versions of the campfire stories. We moved away from auditory storytelling to written storytelling, for thousands of years. I don't know if necessarily because it was superior, but it's because, one, it was new technology. Two, it allowed you to write things down so that they couldn't be mistranslated or mistakes introduced into the retelling of the story. It was written down that way, so that's how it was. So if you read it from the piece of page, then that's the way it was. So I think, in terms of bureaucracy and, history, the written word was better. But was it the best way to tell a story? It's hard to know. I would say I would allow audiobooks to read to me fiction, because there's a lot of pieces in a fiction, especially I would say that middle tier of fiction, that don't require a lot of concentration. You can just have the story sort of wash over you as you're doing something else. You don't have to sit down there and make sure that you're connecting all the dots and you have all these multiple threads moving in together stuff. Some stories are just straightforward, and even some older ones, you can have that. It's like the H. Rider Haggard books I was talking about, King Solomon's Mines. That might actually be a good audiobook, because it was a fun adventure story. It was bouncy, had really good cadence, it kept you moving. And I think if I was listening to an audio book, even knowing the story now, I probably would find that quite enjoyable, and I'd get a lot out of it. I don't think I've ever read, or I stopped a long time ago consuming non-fiction through audio, because it's a whole different kettle of fish. You do have to concentrate. There's a lot of facts going on. It is, I don't know about your experience of reading, but unless you are in the zone, you are constantly rereading a sentence or jumping back a few words and going, hang on, what was that? I got to the end of that sentence. It was long, but how does it connect to the front again? So you quickly go back over it. You can't do that with audio. So you ignore what your mistranslation was. You didn't listen very well. Oh, well, moving on to the next sentence, because you have to, because it's steamrolling forward. And it's sort of, and now you're kind of wondering what it was that he just said, but you've also missed the next sentence he's just spoken about. So the whole paragraph now gets busted. And I just think the first couple of times I did that, I just thought, I've lost so much in this book, I'm not doing it again. I have to read it. And I think, again, adding kinetics into reading is important as well. Have a thin pencil next to you if you are reading hardback, and just underline things or write in the marginalia or write something on your phone or on your iPad or whatever you're using. But add kinetics into it. It's important. Hardback books or physical books themselves they do allow you to, again, get a more helicopter view of the book. You can, if they mention something in this paragraph and you're not quite sure if you remember exactly, you can scroll quickly back and have a look at chapter 5. Oh, right, I remember what that's about, and you go back to where you were. You can't really do that with ebooks efficiently, because you'll lose your place, or a lot of them don't allow you you can bookmark things, but it's kind of hard to remember exactly where it was, because every page literally looks the same because it's on your Kindle. Whereas you can go back to using a hardback book or a paperback book. You can say, I think it was about a third of the way through. So you just visually, you look a third of the way through, open it up, and it's kind of around there. You can't quite remember where it was on an ebook, so you kind of have to spend a lot of time thinking back where it was. So you end up just not, revising, going backwards or looking. You just steamroll forward with an ebook. That is a downside of the ebook. I would also say a downside of the ebook is that it's actually tricking your brain quite often to think that you're reading the same book over and over again, because the font is exactly the same every single time you open up at least a formalized book from Amazon. If you're downloading a PDF, it's different. But I would encourage you to sort of have on random, or to change the font at least every handful of books that you read, because otherwise your brain will quite literally think, I'm still reading this book, because it's exactly the same font size and font style. Other than that, though, I think as long as you're not using books as a decoration for your home, it is important to, I think, buy an actual copy of a book, because, especially older books, because when they get uploaded onto the internet, it's fairly simple for algorithms to run over the top and censor them. And you don't know if that's happened. because they also cover their tracks pretty well, and they'll release something, or you'll go and find something, and you don't know if it's gone through a censorship or some sort of an alteration, by people who don't like the book or thought it should have this in it or whatever. An actual hardback book written closer to the time of publication, you can at least say, well, that's how the author or publisher wanted it to be. And so there's more of a snapshot in time. And the safety, I think, especially these days. Overall, though, I do stay away from audiobooks because I'm just not used to them, but also I don't read a lot of fiction, and I find them actually a negative addition to nonfiction. I think they make the reading experience worse for nonfiction. Others may have, your mileage may vary on that. You may find them absolutely fine, but I don't. So.
I think for now, I feel comfortable with the strong suggestion that the physical copy of a book continues to be the superior method of ingesting the information. The full experience, and I'll explain that in a second. Ebooks frustrate me, and I couldn't decide whether that was because I'm just an older woman who just wasn't born into that generation and I'm not used to it. But you were, and I've just heard what you said, that there's that homogeneity about the font and the presentation. And I could never quite figure out how far in the book I had to go, and so I'd start to get impatient or slightly anxious about, am I getting near to the end of the chapter yet? Audiobooks I can comment on, and I know I've brought this up to you recently. You know well, but listeners may not know, I am a keen knitter in that I want to knit a lot, and I didn't want to give up my crafting time for having to read a book. So an audiobook to me just seemed to be the perfect answer. And we talked about it occasionally, and you would argue the idea. I didn't actually want to believe you because I didn't want to have to give up my knitting time to pick up a physical book again. But recently, so I'm just talking a couple of months ago, I started to realize that I was losing my ability to spell, and it puzzled me. And I am sure, I'm absolutely sure now, it's because I am hearing my literature now and I'm not seeing it on the paper anymore. So that all the spelling skill I'd learned over the years that just was so natural to me, I didn't even realize it was my ability to spell. So now I had these audiobooks and I didn't need to anymore. And I'm staring at this word on my screen going, I know that doesn't look right, but I don't know how to spell it. That's enough for me to go, Nathan was right. I need to factor into my day proper reading again. So I have started that, and it's a discipline that I have to learn again. The other thing I want to say about audiobooks is that I used to think it was a really good idea to listen to audiobooks that were read by the author. But I'm going to call no on that, because it's unlikely that the author is also equally skilled in punctuation, intonation, and basic interpretation of a book. And I just had an example of this last week where she was driving me nuts because she'd be reading her book, but in the sentence I'm hearing, she's gone and put gaps and potential punctuation in where it isn't actually supposed to be there. And I thought, no, it might be free or cheap to get a cheap version of an audiobook, but I'm going to say if you're going to invest in an audiobook, buy an audiobook that has been read by a trained actor or actress or somebody who actually knows what they're doing, so you're not also starting to lose that ability of observing punctuation and how to actually speak English in a good way. So I hope that's also a valuable insight to homeschooling families that have got that digital world in front of them there. I think that's about it for me. Is there anything else you think we should talk about that we haven't?
Maybe, again, different podcast, but there are, the continuing books, the ones that would probably just be personal for me, the ones that have really, that I would suggest anybody would read rather than just boys. That's probably a different podcast and a whole different set. But I think overall, the reason this discussion was important, and hopefully I've added something to it, but regardless, the reason we're talking about this is schooling has become a place that boys aren't meant for. It's not for us anymore. It's not catered to us. A lot of boys quietly check out because I guess they've been burnt so many times in saying something or finding their own way of saying something, whether that's acting out or acting in. Acting in is worse, where you just close. And it's a shame because most of the problems that the world has could be solved in a weekend if we had better men who are well trained. And that's all it is turning a barbarian into a civilized prince, if you will. And education no longer really does that anymore. And I think the education, all it really was, if you really think about it from a level, the good education was just a series of books that were found some sort of a connective tissue between them, hopefully connected by a good teacher with a goal in mind. That's all really education, classical education has been, to create a kind of person. And that's we did cover that earlier, but I think it's important to reinforce that because homeschoolers have an opportunity, I suppose, to recover that ground, to allow their children to become things, especially boys, and it's not necessarily to be a good office worker, but to become the kind of person who people can rely on. And I think that's what an education is. And you're not going to find that in public schools. It's not for boys anymore. I don't even know if it's for girls anymore, but you can. I think it's definitely become obvious that the whole public education system has found a regression to the mean, and the mean leans toward what helps girls facilitate their education, not what helps boys facilitate education. Which is why you often see boys gravitate to sports or video games, because at least there you can, one, it's hierarchical, two, girls don't go there. And it's all the rest of it, we've just sort of, we've retreated from a lot of the other things. And of course, whoever's left over gets to decide what those parameters are now. And it's such a shame because there's so much gold left in education that boys just aren't being exposed to. But don't rely on public schools to do that. As you say, just let them read, put good books in front of them of how men in the past, the great men, have thought, and who knows, you may chisel out a good man.
Yeah, there's no guarantee of the future, but it raises the chances significantly. Just like with food, if you feed a child well, it raises the chances significantly you're going to end up with a healthy adult. It's not by chance at all. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Nathan. I appreciate it, and I know the listeners are going to value your wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.